Hey everyone, Andrew here. Today we're going to take a look at Saloon, a package that makes API integrations a breeze. If you've ever had to work with external APIs in Laravel or any other PHP application, you know that it can be a bit cumbersome. That's where Saloon comes in. Before we get started with it, let's see what a normal API integration might look like in a Laravel app. Alright, so we have 3 different routes here, and each one of them make a call to an external API that I'm hosting on my local environment. Now you can see it doesn't look that bad with Laravel's HTTP helper, but there's a lot of code that's copied between these, specifically the headers that we're using and the beginning part of the API routes. So this can be better. And that's why I'd reach for something like Saloon. We're using version 2 of this, it just released recently, and there's some differences between it and version 1, so just make sure if you're going through the documentation that you're on the right version number. Alright, let's head to the installation page and see what we need to do. It looks like all we need is a composer command, so let's copy this over and open up a terminal window. We can just do this in our code base. Let's open up a terminal and paste our command in. Okay, now that this is finished up, we can clear out of this and we're ready to use it. The first thing that we need to do is create a connector. A connector is a class that holds the requirements of an API integration. What does that mean? It's basically every service that you have will have a connector associated with it. So for us, we're just going to be using one connector since we only have one API that we're working with. But let's say that your application has 3 or 4 different services. Each one of them will have a different connector class associated with them. So here's what one of those looks like. It's just a class that extends the connector class from Saloon and then has a resolve base URL function, which is the base URL for our API. Let's go ahead and copy this code and see where we're going to put this in our application. Saloon recommends that you add these under the app HTTP folder in a directory called integrations. So let's go ahead and create that directory right now. And then in this folder should be a directory for each service that you're using Saloon for in your application. Again, we're just using it for this fake cars API that I've created. So let's create a new directory in integrations called cars. And we'll create our connector in this folder. Okay, so we've created our cars connector PHP file. Let's paste in the example code from the website and change these names around. Okay, so we've changed the class name to cars connector, and we've changed the return value of resolve base URL to the root of the API that we're running locally. So now what do? Well, we need to create a request class for each of the endpoints that we expect to hit with this API. So if we go back to our example here, we are hitting 3 different endpoints right now. We have API cars, cars with an ID, and cars as a post method. So we need 3 separate request classes for our cars connector. And if we scroll down into the documentation, we can see that they give us an example request class here. But if we look above, we can actually use artisan commands to create this class for us, which is a lot easier than having to copy and paste code. And it also will pre-fill in the request name to this class. So let's go ahead and try that instead of copying and pasting this code. Let's go ahead and open up a terminal in our project. So we can just use PHP artisan, Saloon request, and then it requires the integration name, which we can see up here is cars, and then the name of the request class that we want to be associated with this request. So the first API endpoint that we're hitting is just getting all of the cars in our external API. So let's just call this all cars requests. Ooh, and we're getting an error. There are no commands defined in the Saloon namespace. Let's head back to the documentation and see if I did something wrong in the installation. Okay, dependencies are all good. Oh, I didn't see this part down here using Laravel. We need to install an optional Saloon helper, which adds config file, commands, and a facade. Okay, so let's copy this and add this to our composer. Okay, let's see if this resolved that issue. Okay, perfect. So now we have a request folder now in our integrations cars, and we have an all cars request method, which has been scaffolded out for us. So you can see by default, the method is a get method, which is accurate. And then we have this resolve endpoint method down here, which is the endpoint for the request that we're going to be using. If we go into our routes, we can see that it's just API cars. But since we've already defined this part of the API as each one that's being used in this cars service, we just need to specify this part here in the actual request class. So instead of /example, we just have /cars. Okay, so let's see how to use this. Let's go to our route and comment out everything that we have so far. The first thing that we need to do is instantiate that cars connector class. So connector is equal to new cars connector. And then we need to get a response from that connector. It's sending a new all cars request. And we should be getting back some data from it, which we can just return back as response JSON. So let's go ahead and visit this route and see what's coming back to us. Okay, so we can see we're getting back an array of data from our external API. If we scroll down here, we can see that it's actually paginated. So we have a first page URL, next page URL, path, and per page to, and so on. But we are getting data back from our external API, which is perfect. It's exactly what we want. And if we go in here, we can see we've reduced this down from 5 lines to just 3. Except there is one issue though, and that's that we are missing these headers in here. We should be setting these headers because it's what our external API is expecting. We can do this one of two ways. We can go to the request class and we can add a new method called protected function, default headers, which expects an array to be returned. And we just return an array of the headers that are associated with this request. And this will work great if we make the request again, but the problem is that it only is associated with this request. But our external API, if we go back to the routes, every route is expecting those two headers to be associated with it. So instead, we can just copy this whole method out of the request class and add it to the connector class. So now every request that is made underneath this cars connector class will have these two headers associated with it. And remember how I said that this is using pagination? Well, what if I wanted to get a different page associated with this? What if I wanted to make a request to the second page or the third page? We need to add a query variable. Again, there's a couple ways that we can do this depending on how flexible you need this to be. So for instance, in our request class, we can add a new protected function called a default query, which also returns an array. And these will be queries associated with each time this request is made by default. So let's say that we want to always have it return the second page. Now if we go ahead and refresh our browser, we can see here that we're actually on the second page now. So the next page URL is the third, the previous one is the first. So this data that we pulled in is from the second page. But what if I want to be more flexible than that? What if I want to change it with each time that this request is actually used in different controllers or actions or anything else? Well, instead what I can do is make this a constructor. So I can say, all right, the page is a page property associated with this class. And then I can make this property protected page. And then let's create a constructor, which takes in that page integer as an argument and sets it to it. We can also give it a default value if we wanted to, so that by default we're on the first page, or we can change it up if we want to. So now if we go ahead and refresh, we can see that by default we are on that first page, but then in the actual implementation of our request, we can pass in a constructor and give it like the third page. So now if we refresh, we can see that we are on the third page because of this constructor that we had passed into this request. So anything that you wanted to pass in at the request level, you can easily make a constructor and pass it in this way, or you can do the same thing to a connector. We can create a constructor for this class, and that way each time that the connector is instantiated, we can set some default attributes for that one instead. That's kind of the beauty of Saloon is that it makes API integrations in PHP applications so simple while also utilizing the language at hand. There's not a lot of magic behind it. You're using PHP to make these adjustments and create these options. So speaking of which, let's head down to this next route here where we have an individual car that we pull in from the ID. So let's see what this would look like using Saloon. So again, we can instantiate that connector. So connector is a new cars connector. But actually, you see, we're using this twice already. We're copying this code. We should initialize this connector in a constructor. Well, we're not in a class, so we're not going to use a constructor, but we can just create this outside of this route scope. So connector is equal to new cars connector. And then inside of each of these routes, we can just call use connector. Okay, well, we need to create a new request for this. So let's open up our terminal again. And this time we are just getting a single car. So we can create a single car request. And if we open up this file, we are still using the get method, so that hasn't changed. But for the endpoint here, we're doing cars, and then we need to pass in the ID of the car that we want. But that changes depending on whatever is passed into this route here. So like what we did with the request up here, we can say, all right, response is equal to connector, send, new single car request, and let's pass that ID into the constructor. So car ID. And then we'll return response, JSON. Now let's handle what happens when this car ID gets passed in. So let's create a constructor, and we're getting back an int of car ID, and we have to create that attribute in our class. And so even in the constructor, we can do some kind of validation if we wanted to. I mean, we're type hinting at what we're expecting for the parameters, so we'll at least get some help back from like the IDE that we have, but we can even add further layers onto this if we wanted to. And then in the resolve endpoint, we just build the endpoint from cars plus this car ID. And now if we make that request, so let's pull a car out of here. We'll use ID of 23. We're getting back the single object from the external API with the ID of 23. And if we take a look at the route, again, we've reduced this down from 5 lines to just 2. So we've really cleaned up these methods here that we're using to communicate with external APIs. And it makes even more sense because realistically, I mean, yeah, we have created more lines in our code. We have created whole other classes to handle what was just being handled before by 5 lines. So is it really necessary? It depends on your application. For something like this, where we are consuming a single API in 3 endpoints as an example, you're probably not going to need to reach for something like Saloon. But for large scale applications where you have multiple different external services that are all communicating with each other, this becomes invaluable. Okay, so continuing on to our last route, let's see how we can do this in Saloon. Now this is a little different for 2 reasons. 1, we're doing a post instead of a get, and 2, we have authorization here as well. So like with our other 2 requests, let's go ahead and create that class first in our terminal. And we will call this makeCarRequest. And let's open up this one too. So right off the bat, we can change this method here. We don't have a get anymore, we have a post. So this will change things up a little bit. And our resolve endpoint is cars. Yep, okay, cars. So the first thing that I want to do is handle this authentication layer here with this bearer token. And like other things that we have done with this package, there are a couple ways that we can handle this. The first way that we can do this is like our single car requests and our all cars requests, we can pass a value into the constructor. So we can create, all right, protected string key or token, and then we can create a constructor. And then instead of setting that token, we can call this with token auth, and then pass in that token provided to us. So this will set token authorization, which by default looks like an authorization header that is prefixed with bearer and then your token. You can change this bearer here with a second argument in the with token auth method. So we can instead set an empty string, which would prefix it with nothing, but we are using Laravel Sanctum on the external API, so we need that bearer prefix. And on the front end, that looks like this. So let's go ahead and comment out all of this here. Actually, we'll keep the token uncommented because we'll be using that later. And we can do response is equal to connector, send, new make car request, and then it expects that token as the constructor argument. But we know that each time this make car request is being called, it's going to need that token. It requires authorization each time that the request is made. So what we can do instead is require that authorization by default. So let's get rid of the constructor and the property that we have associated with it. And we can create a protected function called default auth that returns a new token authenticator where we have a string for the token. So that is our env API token value, and then a prefix, just like in the method that we showed earlier. Again, though, I'm not going to mess with that because we need bearer. So this is all we need. And then the best thing is that back in the actual instantiation for this, so not only do we not need the constructor anymore, we don't need this token variable either. So we can comment that out. And like everything else, we can return response JSON. So now we are making an authenticated request, and each time that this request class is called to make a request, it's automatically authenticated with that value from our env file. But wait, I'm missing something here. This is a post request. I need these 4 data attributes associated with it to be made inside of this request. And this is pretty straightforward. The first thing that we need to do is in the make car request, we need to add a trait to this. Use has JSON body. So that will associate the fact that this request class will have a JSON body associated with it. We're passing through a JSON object in the body to the request that's being made. And then inside of our actual implementation of this, we're going to create a new request variable to store that make car request object. So now when we send it in the connector, we are sending the request. And then between these two, we add that body. So request body. And we can do these one at a time by using add. So we can add make is equal to request get make. Oh, I should probably change this. So this is make car requests. Let's change that so that we don't confuse the Laravel request we're getting back. Okay, so we can do this one by one by using request body add. Or instead, what I'd like better is request body merge, which takes in an array of attributes. So then we can just copy these attributes from up here and paste them right into this call. Okay, so now whenever we make this request, we'll automatically be sending this body as JSON to our API endpoint. So let's see if this actually works. And we're doing this as a GET request for this example, but I have each of the attributes that our external API is expecting as one of these query variables. So now if we hit enter, I'm getting an error back because I completely messed this up and didn't swap out these 2 request calls for the make car requests. I can't believe I missed that. Okay, so now if we go back and refresh again, you have added a body trait without implementing Saloon contracts has body on your request or connector, which is weird though because I put has JSON body up here. Do I also need to add has body as well? It looks like I do. I need to implement the interface has body as well. So extends request, implements has body. Okay, let's try this one more time. And there we go. We have made an authenticated request to our external API and have gotten back a new model associated with the data that we had used to create it. We can verify this by going to car112 and seeing that we are getting the data back as expected from our external API. And that's the basic functionality behind Saloon. But let's take a little bit and peek at some of the more advanced features. Remember how my API request to get all of the cars is paginated? What if we wanted to grab them all anyway in like a loop that automatically paginates through the API? We can actually do that with an interface added to our connector. So we can say implements has pagination, and then this requires that a new pagination method be added to this class. So protected function paginate, and this requires a few arguments, a request class, and mixed additional arguments. And that expects a paginator to be returned back. There are 3 different kinds from Saloon, paged, offset, and cursor. We are going to be using page paginator because that is what our external API is set up as. So we can return new paged paginator, and we pass in the class. So this, the request, an upper limit of how many items until this loop stops. Let's do 100. And then the spread of the additional arguments. Okay. Oh, And this needs to be changed to public, not protected. All right, now what does this do? How do we use this? Well, if we go back to our routes file here, instead of connector send, what we can do is say connector paginate, and then remove the constructor from the all cars request. And we're going through the pages until we either hit an end and there's no more pages, or we reach our maximum, which we set to 100 objects. Now, instead of just returning the response JSON, we are now getting a loop instead. So this isn't a response, this is a paginator. And we can say, all right, for each paginator as response, and then we can do something with this response JSON. Something better though is that because we're in Laravel, we can call the collect method directly on the paginator, which gets us back a Laravel collection that we can then use those methods for and loop through it or map through it in order to generate an object that we want to return back to the client. So let's say that I want to get back just the make and models of each of these cars. So I can say, all right, the data that we want to return is paginator collect map. And then that is a function that contains each car. And I just want to get back the car's make plus an empty string and the car's model. And then let's go ahead and just return back that data. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. Well, we're getting back an error, undefined property, response make. Oh, I think that's because if we look at the original response we're getting back from the API, you can see that our array isn't the top root element here. It's all underneath this data attribute that we have in the initial returned object back. And so what we can do though is we can pass in that data attribute to this collect method, which means that it'll collect whatever is in that data attribute as the loop goes on. So, okay, now we are mapping through that collection of items, but now we're getting a different error, attempt to read property make on array. That's my fault though. I assumed we'd be getting back an object. It looks like we're getting back an array instead. So let's change this here and use these as keys on the array that we're getting back for each of these items. Okay, now refreshing, we see that we have an array of 111 objects. Each one has our car's make and model separated by a space, which is exactly what we wanted. Except if we scroll down here, we are getting back 111. But if we go to the car's connector, I had set the paginator limit to 100. What's going on? Is that limit the amount of items or is it the limit of pages? I had thought it was the amount of items, but if I go to the documentation, let's see if I can find an answer. Yeah, it just says paginator and it gives the number 50. The per page query parameter is called limits. I really can't find an answer for that, so that might be the amount of pages that it's limited to, which in that case, if I set this to 3, we should be expecting to get back 30 results. No, that still isn't doing it either. So I really don't know what this number is doing in this paginator method here. I assume it's some kind of limit, but I'll have to dig into it some more on the side to determine exactly what's going on with this. It could be something that I'm doing wrong. I have no idea. If you do know though, feel free to fill me in the comments. But yeah, so regardless, we can see that we made one call to our API and we were able to paginate through it entirely until we got to the end and get back a collection of each one of those models that were in those page returns. Something else is that let's say that you have a fickle service, an external API that maybe every once in a while you hit and you get an unexpected response back, but a couple different retries later and everything's in the clear. Well, instead of just doing send, you can do send and retry, which takes in the class that we are expecting as well as 2 additional arguments. So we have the number of retries that you would want to do, and then the amount of time between each of them in milliseconds that you want to space each request out with. So in this case, this will send out our single car request a maximum of 3 times, spacing out each one with 250 milliseconds if it fails. Now, if it fails all 3 times, then an error will finally be thrown, and we can handle that failure at the end. And this is perfect for those services that you might have used that don't exactly have the best uptime or reliable responses coming back. And then finally, what about testing? So let's say I'm in this feature test and I want to test our Saloon functionality. How can I do that? So you can actually create something called mock clients, which takes in an array of mock responses. These use the make static method and then pass in an array of attributes associated with what you expect to get back from the particular client that you're testing. So let's say we're testing out our all cars request method. We expect to get it back a list of cars associated from that external API. And then the HTTP response code that I expect to get back from that is a 200. And then I could add a bunch of these under here as well if I wanted to with different attributes. Because what happens is that each time that I use this mock client, the response that is first in line will be used and then thrown away. So we can use this mock client a maximum of 4 times. But if we're just using it once, it doesn't make sense to add more than one mock response in here. So then to use it, you would create a connection just like before. So we have a new cars connector, except instead of using connection send directly, we're using connection with mock client. And then we pass in our mock client. So now any requests using this connection object will be using this mock client. They won't actually be going out to the external API. They'll be getting back these mock responses that we've included in this constructor up here. And yeah, that's great and all for testing, but I mean, writing out these fake responses can take a decent amount of time, especially if you have a lot of API calls to a lot of external services. And Saloon actually has a brilliant solution for that. So we can actually comment out this mock response that we have here. And instead what we can do is call the request class that we're going to be using down below. So let's say that we're calling this all cars requests class. We can set it to a mock response fixture and give it a name like all cars requests. So now down below, what happens is if I make a new request with this all cars request object from Saloon, what's going to happen is that the first time that this is called, it's going to make a real request out to the external API, but it's going to save that response as a file in your local environment. Each subsequent request that you make after that will use whatever was saved in that file indefinitely. So each time that the request is made again, with this connection and this request class, it is pulling from whatever was saved, but it was pulled from a real initial request. So you don't have to specify your own mock responses, and the data you have saved locally came from an actual external API call. All right, I think I have covered most of what Saloon has to offer. This is a fantastic package by a talented developer and has made working with external APIs an absolute dream for me and quite a few others. If you want to check out more, I've linked this repo and the documentation for it in the video description. As always, if you have any questions about this or any other web development topics, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments or on my Twitter linked below. Thanks for watching.